So the sixth panel is the topic, would Social Security changes prompt people to alter their plans? And the first paper is the behavioral and consumption effects of Social Security changes. Jeff Sanzenbacher is the presenter, and Melissa Kahn from State Street Global Advisors will be the discussant. Take it, Jeff.
So thank you all for having me. Again, Social Security, thank you so much for funding this research. And for all of you who have been here both days, thanks for listening to me twice. I want to thank my co-author, Wenliang, who also works on this paper with me. And I also want to thank Alan Gussman and Tom Steinmeier, who've been gracious enough to allow us to use their model, and I want to thank them for that. This paper is really about how changes to Social Security affect two things, behavior and consumption. So a variety of proposed changes could improve the finances of Social Security. We're all very aware that the trust fund is scheduled to run out in 2034. Something has to be done about that at some point. And there are a variety of things that could be done, ranging from benefit cuts to revenue increases to combinations of those things. The Office of the Chief Actuary evaluates a wide variety of changes to the Social Security program and their impact on that program. And it's also useful, and this is what this paper does, to analyze the individual behavioral effects of any changes and their effects on welfare, in this case through the household consumption. And this project uses the Gussman and Steinmeier structural model, and I'll explain what a structural model is over the next few slides, to evaluate those impacts of changes to Social Security's the program that have similar effects on the program's bottom line. And so structural econometric models present a way to analyze these kinds of effects. So if you think about what a reduced form model does, the kind of linear regression that you're used to seeing, what it would say is, say you increase the FRA. It might look at different birth cohorts who had different FRAs and see how that affected their retirement, controlling for different things about them. What a structural model does is a little bit different. It starts with assumptions on workers' utility function, how they feel towards different things, in this model's case, towards work and towards consumption. It then models their choice set and the financial constraints they face, and it actually estimates how workers kind of feel about those things, about consumption and about working, and it does that based on their observed behavior. So for example, if workers in poor health, you observe them retiring at age 60 before they can even receive Social Security, then you might infer from that that people who are in poor health really hate to work, because why would they retire and have such low consumption? And so the model basically looks at what people does and tries to kind of understand how they feel about the decisions that they face. The really nice thing about these models, and there has to be a nice thing, because I can tell you, working on these models is probably the closest I've ever come to just throwing my computer across the room, but the benefit of them is once you do all that, you can simulate behavior under different constraints. So for example, you can imagine the effect on sick workers of doing something like delaying the early eligibility age. So you could see, maybe you see that some workers actually do work longer to avoid that longer period of low consumption, whereas others who maybe have retirement savings they can use to kind of bridge that gap still retire early because they just like working when they're ill. And so once you have people's preferences, and once you have kind of a model of the constraints they face, you can then change those constraints and see how they respond. And that's basically what a structural model lets you do. That's why it's a useful approach, in addition to the approaches that we're kind of more used to seeing. And so this example really illustrates what I'm basically going to do in this paper, which is change some of the constraints people face with respect to the Social Security program. I'm going to look at three different policies, and all these policies can be calibrated to have a similar effect on Social Security's bottom line, depending on how they're phased in. I'm going to assume, for simplicity, they're all phased in a similar way. But these different changes are the increase in the full retirement age of 69, a reduction in the cost of living adjustment by 0.5 percentage points. We heard Peter Diamond talk about that yesterday, or something similar to that. And then increasing the employee portion of the payroll tax by about 1.5% to 7.75%. So all three of these changes, depending on how they're phased in, can have a similar effect on Social Security's bottom line. What we want to do in this paper is see how they can actually affect individual behavior around retirement and ultimately their consumption over the lifetime. So there are two slides in a row here. Both of them have equations. They're scary. I'm even afraid of them, but I have put boxes around these things so that I can try to explain them. What people in this model do, basically, is they maximize their lifetime utility. They sit at a given time, they look into the future, and they think about what's going to happen to them. They discount the future because you care about yourself today more than you do tomorrow. We're all guilty of that to some extent. You discount the future because you may not make it to see the future. That's the second part of the equation there. And then you get utility from consumption and disutility from labor, although I love coming to work, Alicia. But disutility, some people get disutility from labor. And so basically people sit at a given time, they're looking forward, and they're making decisions knowing that what they do today is going to influence not just the utility they get today, but also the utility they get from things that happen in the future. So that's the first equation. There's one more. And it is basically what's called a budget constraint. Very simple to understand. Your assets at any given time are a function of what you had yesterday multiplied by whatever returns you got. Your labor income, which you get only if you decide to work or not. Your spouse's income, and then your own Social Security and pension income minus consumption. So when you decide to work today, you know that that will affect how much assets you have tomorrow because you won't have income if you decide not to work. If you decide to consume a lot today, you know that tomorrow you won't have as much assets because you consumed it today. People in the model are making these decisions kind of knowing how these things basically play out. So even though the actual way that this all works is relatively complicated, the actual thing that's going on here is something that we all deal with. Pensions and Social Security benefits play an important role in the model. Individuals are assumed to claim Social Security in this model, which is a little bit simple but not that far from reality, as soon as they can, basically, or once their earnings fall below the earnings test. That's becoming a little less true, and they've actually modified their model in a way to allow that decision to be detached. The model that we're using, they're connected. So when people basically completely retire, typically in this model, they claim Social Security. And importantly, the benefits accrue as they do in the real world. As you delay retirement, your benefit goes up with the actual adjustment. And then DB pension wealth is also in the model. It accumulates based on these individuals' actual plan rules. And so a lot of the times those rules will encourage people to retire at a given time or work a given length of time before their benefit kind of hits its maximum. And so all these things are built into the model in that way. So I'm going to try to convince you that when we change this model, we get realistic effects of what people are going to do. And so the first thing I'd hope that you want to know is, does it actually at least fit the real world that it was estimated on? And this model does. So the model fits the behavior of those it was estimated on well. On this graph, we have the ages 50 to 64 going from left to right. The red line is actual behavior of the HRS cohort, cohort born between 1931 and 1941. And then the behavior predicted by this structural model that I just described, and you can see that it fits fairly well. Importantly, it mirrors the big increase in complete retirement you see at age 62 when Social Security becomes available. The model doesn't enforce that in any way. It's simply because once you hit 62, the financial incentives become such that it makes more sense to retire at that time. So the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to change the environment that this model was estimated on, and I'm going to tell you how people respond. And for you to believe that, you want to believe that the model can actually fit things that have actually happened. We call this external validation. We check to see if the model can predict changes that have already happened. So in an earlier paper, I get to plug my own work. That's always fun. We examined how well this model can predict the effect of 4 changes. So between the HRS cohort that this model was estimated on originally and a cohort born 12 years later, 4 really big things happened. Health improved, mortality improved, people are living longer. There was an increase in the FRA, and there was a shift towards DC pension plans. And so what we did is we said, well, what if we took the HRS cohort this model was estimated on, and what if we made them look like a cohort born 12 years later in terms of these 4 things? And what we wanted to see was, does it actually look like the model can predict what we actually see? I wouldn't be telling you all this if it didn't work, I guess, but it did. It did. The model predicts the responses of these changes quite well. So if you look here, we have the from ages 50 to 69 here. The black line is the actual HRS cohort. The dotted line is the simulated HRS cohort if you made them look like the cohort born 12 years later. And the red line is the actual early boomer cohort, what we actually saw. And you can see that dotted line does show the decrease in complete retirement of a relatively similar magnitude as we actually saw in the data. Time will tell as this cohort ages whether or not the model continues to predict the gap correctly. But at least this should give you some confidence that this model can predict how people change their behavior in response to some fairly big changes in the economy that took place over that time period. Okay. So the last thing I'll tell you about the model before I show you some results is just that this model was actually estimated on a Social Security environment that is different than we have today. So it was estimated in a world where the FRA was 65, for example. Obviously, the reforms I'm talking about jump off of a different point in time, and so we're going to use as a baseline policy an FRA of 67, a DRC of 8% per year that starts at after 67, and no earnings test over the RFA, more the environment that these changes are using as their starting point. And importantly, the baseline assumes the benefit schedule as under current law. Obviously, if we continue on our path now, that benefit will be reduced by 30% in 2034. We're assuming right now that the baseline is that the situation goes on as it is right now. So that's worth keeping in mind as well. Okay, so what I have here is a somewhat complicated table. I'll ask you to focus just on the 3 columns there on your right. Those are the percent change in complete retirement at ages 62 to 69 for each of the 3 policies I described: an FRA increase, a COLA reduction, and a tax increase. You can see the FRA increase decreases the share of people fully retired by between basically 2 and 4.5%, depending on the age you look at. The COLA has a slightly smaller reduction, between 2 and 2.5%, and the tax increase a much smaller effect on behavior. It actually encourages people to retire slightly earlier because work is slightly less valuable, but the effect is fairly small. This is a fairly small tax increase of 1.5%, so it doesn't have a huge behavioral effect. To think about why the COLA has a smaller effect, just consider that when you actually claim Social Security, the fact that you reduce the COLA doesn't really show up for quite a bit of time after that, so the effect is kind of lagged. And people do discount the future, so they don't necessarily take it quite into the consideration as they do with something like the FRA increase, which has an immediate effect. The effect of the benefit reduction tends to be larger for low-income workers, and the reason is fairly simple. They're just more reliant on Social Security. They have less in other kinds of benefits. If you look on the left 3 columns, there are increase in the FRA to 69. We have low, middle, and high third of the income distribution. And then we have the COLA reduction. You can see for the FRA, for the low group, the effects are between 4.5 and 7% reductions in complete retirement. That's compared to the 4% we saw earlier. For the high income group, the effect's smaller, typically around 2% reduction. For the COLA reduction, for the low group, the effect is between 3 and 4% reduction in complete retirement. For the high income group, just 1%. And so the behavioral effects for the benefit reductions do tend to be larger for lower income people. The timing of consumption changes differs considerably across these 3 policies. So this, on the x-axis here, we have ages 25 to 90. The black line there is the tax increase, the red line, the COLA reduction, the gray line, the FRA increase to 69. What you can see is that the tax increase results in a 1.5% reduction in consumption, which is basically the size of the tax increase, during the working years. That effect starts to dissipate during retirement with the reduction due to the fact that people saved less while they were working because of the tax increase. The effect basically becomes null as people age and stop relying on their savings and start relying just on Social Security. So in the long run of that policy, the effect in retirement actually is shrinking. For the COLA reduction and the tax increase, there's very little effect during the working years. It tends to pick up in the 50s when people start to recognize the benefits reduced and they start to save a little bit more. And then you see that during retirement, there is a larger reduction in consumption, ranging from 2 to 7 or 8% by the time people are in their 70s and 80s and 90s. The COLA reduction has a smaller effect at first, but that effect picks up as people get older, and the fact that their real income is kind of shrinking starts to actually take hold. The consumption effect is similar across income groups for a tax increase because it's a flat tax increase that affects most income groups the same. But for the benefit reductions, the reductions just tend to be larger relatively for low-income people, again, for the exact same reason that they tend to rely on Social Security as their main source of income in retirement, whereas these other groups have other sources they can rely on. So for the low-income group, the reductions are between 6 and 8% for the FRA increase, and as low as 12% for the COLA increase as that COLA increase kind of takes hold later in life. The effects are smaller for high-income groups. So in conclusion, I think that reductions in benefits are likely to have a larger effect in retirement, maybe somewhat obviously, both in terms of behavior and in terms of consumption. Tax increases have a smaller effect on consumption in retirement, but they do have a longer period of decreased consumption during the working lives, and to some extent that does carry over into retirement through slightly decreased savings. And hopefully I've convinced you that structural models are a useful way to kind of frame the debate on what kind of changes to Social Security should we implement. And with that, I thank you.